Should we start? Okay, everyone. I think we'll get started, even though we still have some coffee and some light breakfast snack, maybe. Welcome, everyone, to this seminar. I think we all know there's a growing perception that the world is becoming more violent. And this seems to be a global sentiment. But the question is, of course, is this a narrative that is created by the media, or is it actually the reality? Today, we will examine the current conflict trends using the newly updated, and when I say quite newly, because it was published today, data from the UCDP, Uppsala Conflict Data Program, to explore the new trends. My name is Syria. I'm the research director here at PRIO, and I will lead this seminar. We will start off with a presentation of the new UCDP data, led by Therese Pettersson, followed by a panel discussion. Therese is a senior analyst and the project leader in the Uppsala data program. And she's been working with the conflict data for many years. So Therese, please.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to come back to Oslo to present the conflict trends. So our data was released today, covering 2024, but also some revisions for earlier years. And these data and trends will be analyzed in an article in the Journal of Peace Research that hopefully will be available this week. And also in the conflict trends report, which is available on that table over there, which was released today. So there is plenty of material for those who want to dig deeper into the trends in conflict data. I will present the data for 2024 and how that fits into the bigger picture. And I will also talk a little bit about the theme for our article in the Journal of Peace Research this year, which is the challenges that we meet in trying to classify the victims, so separating civilians from militant victims in the data. And there will be time for questions afterwards. So just to refresh your memory, UCDP collects data on 3 types of violence: state-based conflicts, where the state is fighting another state, or one or several rebel groups that want to either overthrow the government or take control of a certain piece of territory. The second category is non-state conflicts, where the state is not one of the primary warring parties. So that can be rebel groups fighting each other, militias, ethnic groups, religious groups, drug cartels, and other organized crime actors. And the third category is one-sided violence. And this is capturing violence that is explicitly targeting civilians. So suicide attacks against purely civilian targets, for example, churches, mosques, schools. It can be executions of opposition politicians and massacres. The important thing to keep in mind is that most civilian victims in UCDP data is not captured by this category. Because when civilians die in crossfire or in indiscriminate types of warfare, such as airstrikes or shelling, but where the target is a militant group, those civilians will be counted in the state-based conflict category. So if you want to use UCDP data to study civilian victimization, you need to take this into consideration, that you will find civilian victims in all 3 categories. And this is very important in the case of Gaza, for example. So Israel stating that they're targeting Hamas or other militant groups in Gaza, but many civilians, or sometimes only civilians, die. These will be coded to the state-based category. We have this threshold for inclusion, at least 25 direct battle-related deaths during 1 year for a conflict to be considered active in UCDP data. And the 3 categories are mutually exclusive, so you can add them together. This graph shows the trend in fatalities in all 3 categories since 1989. The gray area in the background is the total, and the black line dominating the picture for most years is state-based violence. So you can see that state-based violence is driving this trend, with the main exception being the Rwandan genocide in 1994. We see this peak in 2022 when we had 2 extraordinarily lethal conflicts going on at the same time. So the war in Ukraine and the war in Tigray, Ethiopia. Since then, fatalities have dropped by almost half. And in 24 and 23, we see similar levels of violence. But despite this drop, 2024 is still the fourth deadliest year in state-based conflict since 1989 and the fifth deadliest year overall. So with the only exception being the Rwandan genocide and the 3 preceding years. So 21, 22, 23, 24, and 94 are the 5 deadliest years during this time period. Combining the UCDP data with the PRIO BattleNets data to look at the longer trends. So this is only state-based conflicts, which means you won't see the Rwandan genocide here. But we can see that this peak in 2022 is actually on par with the large wars of the 20th century. So the peaks here are driven by Korea, Vietnam, and Iran-Iraq wars. So this peak in 2022 is actually a big one. And just going back to this is the first year that we won't truncate the axis to be able to show the other trends, like when we include the Rwandan genocide. This is the first time that we were able to sort of just keep the figure as it is. So that shows how violent these past few years have been. The geographic distribution of violence, this is using the PRIO grid system, so showing where in the world violence took place in 2024. We see Ukraine, the Middle East with Gaza, Syria, and also a lot of countries in Africa. In the Latin American countries, we have a lot of non-state violence, so we can see that registered there. If we instead turn to the number of conflicts, so this is focusing on state-based armed conflicts specifically, and this shows the number of active armed conflicts since 1946. We can see that it is increasing, and we had the highest number ever recorded by the UCDP since the starting point of the data collection. I stood here last year and said the same thing. So we had the highest number ever recorded by the UCDP, but it increased with 2, so 59 to 61 for 2024. And this is worrying, of course. When conflict started to increase in 2013, this was driven primarily by IS, so them spreading to new areas, challenging new governments, and thereby creating new conflicts. But this recent increase cannot really be explained by IS only. So it's a mixture of new conflicts, restarted conflicts, and many different types of conflicts. So it's not one problem that we need to sort of solve. It's very diverse. Most of these conflicts are rather small, but 11 of these 61 reached the intensity level of war, which means that they caused 1,000 battle-related deaths during the year. And this is also an increase since the year before. So we had 9 wars in 23 and 11 wars in 24. The darkest area, the black area at the bottom, those are the interstate conflicts. And you can see that there are relatively few, so why care about those, right? But we can see that they increased, and we had 4 in 24. This is the highest number since 1987. And of course, this is worrying because those carry the potential to be much more deadly than other conflicts when you had 2 states fighting each other. So this is definitely a worrying trend, and we see conflicts that have been, where there have been sort of tension and conflict issues for decades or even centuries, but they haven't fought each other to the level of reaching the activity threshold in UCDP data. For example, Afghanistan, Pakistan, which they have disagreed over their common border, the Durand Line, since the 19th century, but 2024 was the first year where they actually fought each other, making the conflict active, although there have been smaller skirmishes along the border for many years. So to sum up, highest number ever recorded with 61 active conflicts. Similar levels of fatalities, it was a marginal decrease. 4th deadliest year in state-based conflict and the 5th deadliest year overall. And we see the number of wars increasing, and violence escalated in Lebanon, so the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, in Ethiopia, in the Amhara region, in Pakistan, in Syria with the fall of the Assad regime, which we will talk more about in the panel discussion, and also in the DRC, where this Rwanda-backed rebel alliance led by M23 seized a lot of territory by the end of the year, and that fighting has also continued into 2025. We did see violence de-escalating in Burkina Faso, Gaza, and Somalia, but all three of those are still on the list of the most violent conflicts. And we know that Gaza, the ceasefire broke down during the spring now in 2025. In Burkina Faso, the rebels are really on the offensive. So these are not happy stories. It's just that violence de-escalated in 24 compared to in 23. So looking at the other two categories, in non-state conflict, we did see a small decrease, but both these categories are so much smaller than the state-based category, if you remember the first graph. We did see a decline in non-state violence in Africa and the Americas since their peak in 2021. But Mexico is still dominating this category when it comes to fatalities. And actually 4 non-state conflicts in Mexico caused more than 1,000 deaths in 24. So we don't use that definition for non-state conflicts commonly, like the definition of war, but if we would, 4 of these conflicts in Mexico would reach that level. And looking at the graph here, you can see the gray area in the background is the total, and you can see the Americas dominating this picture since 2017, but also that we see this small decline recently. In one-sided violence, we did see a sharp increase, both in the number of actors, but mostly in the fatalities being caused by these actors. IS is the main actor here for the 10th year in a row. It's the actor causing most fatalities in the one-sided category. And they escalated their attacks in 24 after fewer attacks in 23. And especially in Africa and the DRC, where they relocated to new areas, and as they did, they targeted civilians in those areas. And one-sided violence is often connected to state-based conflicts. So the other 2 actors here, RSF and JNIM, and the governments in Sudan and Burkina Faso as well, are using a lot of one-sided violence connected to the state-based conflicts ongoing. So anyone who would be suspected of, like villagers being suspected of supporting the rival side, the actors will sort of take revenge on those civilians in those villages, and then they become a legitimate target. They're really caught between a rock and a hard place, so it's hard to not be seen as a legitimate target for any of the sides. The graph here shows that, well, the black line is Africa. You can see that Africa is really driving the trend in one-sided violence, and that we usually see quite low levels of this type of violence with some exceptions. So the Rwandan genocide, DRC in the late 1990s there. If we look at the deadliest conflicts of 24, Russia-Ukraine is in the top, followed by the war between Israel and Palestine, so mainly Gaza. Sudan, we have 3 non-state conflicts on this list, all in Mexico. And this list is basically the same as last year, with the only exception being this conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. That escalated last year during the fall, following the Israel detonation of hundreds of pagers and walkie-talkies, and then launching a ground offensive and airstrikes towards Lebanon. So, as I said, this year we're also focusing a bit on the civilian to combatant deaths ratio, which is important to identify war crimes and crimes against humanity, and to know the needs for post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation, and it will affect the international opinion and response. So this shows the proportion of civilians, unknown, and combatants victims in UCDP data. since 1989. So the combatants will be side A, side B, and then we have the civilians, and then we use this unknown category where it is unclear if the victim was a civilian or not, or if it's unclear which side the victim belonged to. And we can see that information became better following 2010-11 with the growth of social media and a changing information landscape overall. So before that, we had many major wars where we had to rely on summary figures, not giving us the fine-grained, detailed information that we want. But we can see that in the past 2 years, this share of unknown fatalities has increased again. And this has been driven by primarily 2 different cases or regions. So this shows only 2024 data and broken down by the different regions. So we can see that in the Americas, we have this huge share of unknown fatalities. In Mexico, 97% of all the deaths coded by UCDP are found in the unknown category. And this is because of the non-state conflict between the drug cartels there. So the line between who is a civilian and who is a militant is often blurred, and they don't fight it out in battles. It's more violent messaging, so bodies being found, massacres, beheadings, and it's really hard to know who was a civilian and who was a member or connected to a rival gang. So we're using this category to signal uncertainty in the data that we don't know. The Middle East is another region with a large share of unknown fatalities, and this is driven by cases such as Gaza. So when we have a densely populated area being targeted with indiscriminate types of warfare, so airstrikes, shelling, drones, this will both result in a large civilian death toll, but given that restricted access to the area and the destroyed infrastructure, meaning that it's really hard to report and document what's going on, that will also result in a big share of unknown fatalities. So this is, hopefully, we will be able to improve this data in the future, especially for Gaza. I think this will be possible. And this is also to highlight the need for always going back and revising the data, which we do every year. So this year, when we release data for 2024, it's not only that, but it's also a lot of better data for earlier years when we find new and better reports, or where there are post-conflict investigations giving us better information. Like I said, the article will be out any day now. Soon, I hope. Yeah, great. So yeah, we're available everywhere if you want to reach out if you have questions later. But there will also be time for questions now, or
we'll do the panel first, and then
yeah. All right. Thank you. Should I close this? Or? Oh, I don't know. Sorry. What did I do?
maybe you can just leave the graph, the main graph there.
The first one?
Yeah.
Mm?
Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. So we'll now continue with a panel discussion to try to dig a little bit deeper into the trends and the data. So in addition to Teresa, I'm also joined by my PRIO colleague, research professor Jørgen Jenshaugen. But Teresa, thank you for your very interesting presentation of the data. And I think the data do confirm the sentiment that the world is getting more violent, or at least persistent violent. But we also see that the numbers are driven, at least the fatalities are driven by Gaza and Ukraine. And when I was looking at the data for the first time, I was struck by the fact that the data from Sudan, the fatalities from Sudan, was much lower than I expected. I think you showed it was around 4,500 reported fatalities, which seems low compared to the fact that this is the biggest humanitarian crisis, one of them, and that we have. what are your thoughts on that? Or
So, first of all, the information situation in Sudan is extremely difficult. So, the international media is overshadowed by the war in Ukraine and Gaza, and local media has been shut down. A lot of media houses, or most of them, cannot operate. It's a really hard situation for journalists in general to operate in, and internet has been blocked for a lot of time as well. So that's one reason, the information situation, that we don't know. No one is reporting. The other reason is that we have so many different types of violence going on at the same time. So you can't really only look at the battle-related deaths. Both parties, so RSF and SAF, are both using a lot of one-sided violence against civilians, as I mentioned. And there are a lot of things going on at the same time. So you would have to look at all these conflicts, but that also means that some of it will be hard for us to classify. And the third reason is a lot of indirect deaths. So the numbers that are being circulated about deaths in Sudan, which are very sort of unclear and no one really knows, but the ones that are out there also include a lot of indirect deaths. So UCDP only codes direct fatalities, so caused directly by battles or weapons. And more people die from famine, from disease in Sudan. And those are also very hard to separate in those numbers that we do get from there. So I would say those three reasons are causing these relatively low numbers in Sudan. But we should remember that, 4,700 or something, that's a quite large war if you would have looked at this like 10 years ago.
yes.
So it's being overshadowed by these other.
And I think that's your last point here is really important, that the war in Gaza and Ukraine are overshadowing a lot of what else is going on in the world. Yeah. And also, you mentioned this in your talk, that one of the things that we see this year is that there seems to be a slight increase or increasing trend over the past years of international conflicts, so state versus state conflicts. You mentioned Afghanistan, Pakistan, but we had 4 this year. But we also know in sort of for 2025, there's been increasing tension in India, Pakistan, in Kashmir. We also know that there is tension between Israel and Syria. So potentially an even further increase in 2025. What are your thoughts on this? Are we seeing a trend with more interstate wars going on, and what does that mean?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a trend. The numbers are so low, so it's hard to tell, but it is definitely a trend. If we're looking at the past decade, we had 22 interstate conflict years. And the decade prior, we had 5. So there is definitely an increase in interstate conflict. And as you said, there are several examples in 2025 already that will be included next year. We have seen countries fighting over shared borders, for example, more in the latest, in recent years than before. And we also see this increase in states supporting rebel groups against other states. So those will be intrastate conflicts, internationalized intrastate conflicts, but essentially you have a state on each side. So this is definitely a trend. And as I said, it's worrying because the resources are so much bigger usually than guerrilla groups or rebel groups have access to. So they can be deadlier than other conflicts.
Yeah. Thank you. I think you were pointing to something that's definitely a trend that we need to keep an eye on in the coming years. But also, when we look at this graph, and we look at 20 years ago, so early 2000s, it was a relatively peaceful period. And it has increased now. But you also pointed out when we compare the fatalities from 1946 up until now, that what we see now is at par with what happened 35, 40 years ago. So one of the things I've been sort of thinking about is rather thinking that this is what we are now seeing is an extraordinary period with more violence, is that the period around 2000 up until around 2013 was extraordinary. Do you think that's true, or and what did we actually? Why was that period so peaceful, and is there something we can learn from that?
I do think that this is the new normal. That period was the exception, and that followed a period where we had a lot of focus on international peace building, on mediation. There was many peace agreements were being signed during or before those years. Now we don't see a lot of peace agreements being signed, almost none. And the UN is not functioning in that peace building capacity as it could or should, and other agencies as well. Conflicts are more complex, I guess. So it makes it harder to end. Like conflicts, they don't end, they just go on. Some of them drop below the threshold for inclusion, but it's not like we see conflicts being, like conflict issues being resolved. So I do think that we need to come up with a way to deal with these conflicts, to find ways to initiate a dialogue, to be able to negotiate deals that will end these conflicts or control these conflicts. And this is also a consequence of the end of the rules-based world order, US not playing the role of the world police, other actors stepping in, and growing tension between major powers in the world in general, I think.
Yes, an absolutely worrisome picture. Jürgen, you're an expert on the Middle East, and particularly Gaza, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a country where we actually have seen some change, and that's Syria. So in late 2024, the Assad regime fell, and we saw a lot of change and a lot of hope going on. But could you say a little bit more about what's going on in Syria right now? Is it better? Is it more hopeful?
So first of all, I'd just like to thank you for including somebody, in this case me, but that does this kind of deep singular studies, because I think it's very important that we do combine these large end studies with kind of deep singular studies, both because people like me need to have this overview, but I think also when we have the overview we need to have that deep understanding of the individual cases, and I think you're absolutely right. Syria is a good news case. However, that does not mean that it's not problematic. And I had to ask you, how much time can you give me? Because it's rather complicated to explain what kind of territory we're entering into in Syria. So just, to start off, Syria is good news because the Assad regime is gone. Now, Assad ruled with the iron fist since 1970. That's not in itself a conflict question, but in terms of democracy, that's one of the worst authoritarian regimes we've had. And since 2011, it waged a war on the Syrian people under the slogan, Assad or we burn the country. And it's hard to get the precise numbers because the UN just gave up counting. But the Syrian Center for Human Rights estimated that between 80% and 90% of all civilians killed during that war were killed by the regime. And we can add tens of thousands killed in industrial level torture chambers and prisons. So it's just the numbers and brutality of that regime was just horrendous, with tools of war including indiscriminate methods like barrel bombs, chemical weapons, and enforced starvation of entire cities. So, removing that is just in itself good. But that does not mean that we're not entering, uncharted and difficult territory. So I'm going to focus on just a couple of examples of that to illustrate, where we're heading, where we could be heading. So the first issue is Alawite and regime violence, and I'm not talking about the new regime. In March 2025, around 1,000 people were killed in that kind of violence in the Alawite coastal heartland, meaning Latakia, Tartus, that area. And reasons behind that sectarian violence are very complex. Now, the Alawite community, for very complicated reasons, which I don't have time to explain, are associated with the Assad regime. And there is a large desire for vengeance among many Syrians against the Alawites for this reason. And I'd just like to, enhance the point that it's not like if you're an Alawite, you're part of the regime, but that is association that's very much apparent for many Syrians. And at the same time, as there is this desire for vengeance from many Syrians, there are Assad loyalists among the Alawites that want to take back what they lost when Assad fell. So what happened in early March was that the regime army was ambushed by Assad loyalist militias in Alawite areas. And then militias that were formerly part of the Syrian regime entered those areas and went on a rampage and started killing Alawite civilians. And the army was slow to stop this, and they were unable to kind of rein in their own troops. So, up to 1,000 or above 1,000 people were killed. And this really illustrates two challenges that we're facing in Syria going forward. The first is that sectarian violence in a post-Assad Syria, combined with a lack of transitional justice, is a very worrying thing. And I think especially the minorities, not only the Alawites, but also the Druze, for instance, are very worried about the future. The second is that there is an absence of government control over the multitude of militias that formed part of this loose alliance that fought the Assad regime. So they had kind of a common enemy while they were fighting Assad, but once Assad was gone, how are they going to build a cohesive or coherent military structure? They're doing a decent job at it, but as this Alawite violence showed, we're not there yet. And this can easily break apart if things go south in other areas as well. The second area is the Kurdish-Turkish conflict. Now, of course, that happens in Turkey, but it also happens in all border areas. And in Syria's northeast, there are various Kurdish groups, mostly under the umbrella of the SDF, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, which, as was highlighted here, were key in fighting ISIS. But they were also in direct conflict with either the Turkish state or Turkish-affiliated militias, such as the Syrian National Army, the SNA. Now, the SNA is really the militia that was involved in the Alawite violence. But the SNA has been formally integrated into the Syrian army. And the SDF is in a similar process. They've signed an agreement with the regime, and they are busy integrating. But they have such a factional nature, these two groups, that it makes it very difficult to predict how the Syrian government is going to have control over them in the future. So you might get kind of fighting between these groups, and you might have a breakup of the government military structure. And this is obviously problematic for the regime, but it also means that there is an overhanging potential for instability in Syria. And then I'm just going to briefly mention three other issues, but I'm just going to keep them very, very brief. They're more simple, so I don't less acronyms. So ISIS was destroyed. Nominally, but they're still there in the desert and in certain urban areas, so they can reappear. There have been terrorist attacks from them, so there can be an increase in ISIS violence. Israel has really stepped up the violence in Syria, really, taking over Mount Hermon, destroyed the demilitarized zone by basically taking it over, occupying large areas of Syrian territory, but also going very far in destroying the Syrian state's military hardware. Now, from Israel's perspective, that's the argument is we don't want this advanced weaponry to get into the wrong hands. But if we take the other things I've talked about into that context, what it means is that the state is less capable of controlling the militias that are the problem for the other two challenges. So this is not just like a problem between Syria and Israel, it's also a problem for the Syrian state in terms of controlling the other problems. Then lastly, there's the Iran, Hezbollah, and the Captagon and arms smuggler network. Now, they were basically destroyed once Assad lost. But if a power vacuum appears, they want to find a way back in. And they're working very hard to find a way back in. So to just end, I want to paraphrase what I've heard from a lot of Syrian activists. And that is that they are stuck in this perpetual balance between hope and fear. Of hope after Assad and fear of what can come, and I think it really falls on everybody involved to make sure that this time hope prevails.
Thank you. I think your description sort of underscores what I've been sort of arguing about conflict trends for the past few years, that it's becoming more complex. That you have lots of actors, and the actors do not necessarily keep within borders, and it's a very difficult landscape to get overview over, basically. You mentioned it a little bit now with Israel, that the situation in Syria now do have larger consequences for both the Middle East region, but also possibly for Europe. Could you say a little bit about how you think that this will affect both the larger Middle East and Europe in the coming years?
So I think it can affect. There are several areas where this conflict in Syria, the end of the conflict in Syria, really touch upon Europe and the region. I think the first to mention is what we in Europe talk about, the refugee crisis. Now, it's really a Middle Eastern refugee crisis. The European numbers of refugees are just minuscule compared to what countries in the Middle East are housing. If you look at the numbers of people thinking that it's possible to return to Syria, or that because of the situation want to return in the near future, they just made this massive jump between Assad being in power and the fall of Assad. The problem, of course, with those numbers were they were from the kind of euphoric post-Assad period before all these challenges started, really manifesting themselves. So it's very hard to get grasp of those numbers, but there is a potential for a huge return wave of refugees that want to rebuild Syria or want to be at home in Syria. So that's kind of on refugee level area. The other is all these connected conflicts. So, for instance, Hezbollah have gotten weapons smuggled through Syria into Lebanon. So it has a direct effect on Lebanon because Hezbollah is weakened in Lebanon because of Israel's warfare against it, but they're also weakened because of the fall of Assad, because it destroyed their access to weapons. Now, that gives them an increased desire to, regain power in Syria, or somebody they support to regain power in Syria so that they can reinstitute that smuggling network. So there are all these interconnected, conflicts going on. Iran wants to reassert itself. Russia is, trying to figure out how to retain its position in Syria even after they were kicked out, and they've retained their military bases, the most important ones. And I think this is one of those areas where if, the West makes wrong decisions, it's very easy for Iran and Russia to find a way back in because Syria needs money. So I think the lifting of the sanctions is a very good thing in the sense that it opens up for rebuilding the economy without the economy being dependent on Russia, Iran, smugglers, etc.
Thank you. I have a couple of a little bit more, maybe broader questions to both of you. So we know violence is increasing, but we're also witnessing a very sharp decline of aid, mainly with the shutdown of USAID, but also other aid actors retracting their support. How do you think that's going to affect the current conflict picture and also future? Therese, maybe we can start with you.
Sorry. So the relationship between humanitarian aid and conflict is not clear-cut, but the decrease of well-functioning aid, of course, may increase inequality, economic hardship, and this increase in stability in countries, which may increase the risk of conflict, of course. It will make it harder for refugees and so on. I think the main question is who will fill this void. So we see that China, if we compare now with 10 years ago, China is such an important actor in the African continent, for example. So I think that's a very interesting, I don't have the answers, but it's a very interesting development. So what will that do for world peace or world conflict?
Jürgen, do you have any thoughts on this?
So I think I'll try to answer in terms of how the US administration has engaged diplomatically and politically in these areas. I think regarding Ukraine, I think what the US has been doing is a bad strategy and acted terribly. I mean, it's flip-flopping one way or the other, and it's impatient, it's erratic, it's incoherent, which just makes for the kind of opening Russia has been looking for. So in terms of solving that war, it's just bad news. Gaza, I think it's even worse, because while Trump was able to, just before entering office, really strong-arm Israel into agreeing to the ceasefire, he then went on to allow Israel to break that ceasefire. And he green-lighted ethnic cleansing by the so-called Riviera plan, where basically he said, Gaza should be emptied of Palestinians, and then we can move in as urban developers. And it was clear that from the beginning that Trump himself or the U.S. was not going to do that, but by signaling that ethnic cleansing was a desired or even a possible outcome, and then pulling out of the whole issue, basically meant that for Israel, now there is a green light and acceptance for ethnic cleansing. And what that means for the conflict dynamic in Gaza is just nothing but terrible news. And we see it in the kind of, escalation of use of famine in war, giving Israel access to the heaviest bombs again. It's just terrible news. In Syria, however, this is one of those issues where I see that what Donald Trump has done is just very good news. Now, once again, it was kind of seemed like spur of the moment. He just met al-Sharaa and said he was handsome and said, we'll lift sanctions. But it did create this kind of dynamic where actors in the Middle East and in Europe were just really waiting and hoping for sanctions relief, but they didn't dare do anything because the way the sanctions were structured, they all depended on the US. So the US was kind of like the linchpin in the sanctions system. So once the US said we're lifting sanctions, Qatar just went in with money and said we're paying all the salaries of Syrian civil servants, which means that the state can function. And when the state functions, that reduces the risk for all the other things I've mentioned, right? But until the US sanction relief had happened, that wasn't possible. Now, this is not a silver bullet, right? But it is one of those great openings that can make positive change.
Do you think that visit in Syria was planned, or do you think that was, as you say, spur of the moment? Or did it just come across as a spur of the moment, or do you think it was planned?
It came across as spur of the moment, and it wasn't planned until just before. Now, the push came from, as far as I read it, it came from Saudi Arabia, it came from Turkey, it came from actors in the region. Macron tried to push him into doing it as well. But as my reading was, it was really the Saudi and Turkish influence that made him decide, let's go for it. And the US system itself was kind of shocked by it. The Republicans got behind him, but they weren't prepared. I mean, the whole US system was taken aback by this and just had to adapt running.
So it was basically a non-normal thing for this administration to do.
Yeah.
So we should hope for more spur of the moments then, I guess. Therese, do you have any thoughts on sort of how the US administration and their change in behavior will affect conflict trends on a larger scale?
Well, having this unpredictable loose cannon in charge, it's not good for stability, of course, and for peace building, where you need to have like reliable commitments and sort of plan ahead. But I do think that for these conflicts that tend to be very, very hard to solve, it can add an element of surprise or thinking outside the box or not acting according to the norms, for example. So that could potentially open up situations so that we could actually find ways of negotiating peace. But once that deal has been reached, this unpredictability, it's not creating a good environment, I think, for long-lasting peace. But yeah, this loose cannon effect could definitely be an interesting element in some of the more long-lasting conflicts.
Thank you both. We'll open up for Q&A if someone from the audience have. We are streamed, so just so that you know that this will be recorded as well. Julia, please. Get a microphone.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Julia, and I work at PRIO as a senior researcher, and I have a question to Therese. You elaborated a little bit upon peace agreements, and I know that UCDP quoted up until 2021 peace agreements. But if you can talk a little bit about whether you're planning to update that particular data set and what are the trends that you have been seeing, and especially when it comes to not only the overall number of peace agreements, but also the different types, whether the process agreements have increased or they haven't increased at all. So if you can reflect a little bit on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we haven't been able to update the data set for a few years. We have sort of the same set of resources, no matter how violent the world is. So right now, we're really struggling to keep up with the pace of the conflicts in the world. But we're working on that at the moment. So my colleague Stina Högblad, who is the peace agreement person at UCDP, she is working on updating the data set. There have been a few peace agreements, for example, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, which is one of those interstate border conflicts that we've seen recently. They've signed a lot of partial peace agreements, and then early this year, I think, this final sort of demarcating their whole border. So there are definitely peace agreements being signed, but there are not that many. I think I'll have to wait for the update of the data set to be able to look at the trends and discuss that further, unfortunately. But I'm hoping that it will be soon rather than later.
Thank you. I have 4 questions now, here, and then 2 over there. So we'll start with the gentleman in the right.
Thank you very much for a deeper presentation of this question of conflict and development conflict. I have just 2 questions. One is that on Syria, it was actually Western democracies who actively supported rebel groups within Syria to get rid of Assad. Yeah. So in many cases, what's interesting is that democratic countries in the West support non-democratic movements in the hope that they will provide democracy once when the dictator is fallen. But it's not happening. So it's kind of an interesting thing is that where does the role of evangelizing democracy in Syria actually has not really resulted as we had hoped for? Are then there democratic forces within Syria that actually eventually take over? That's my question. Other one is that you mentioned briefly about the India-Pakistan conflict now. Do you think both countries being nuclear, is it in a way preventing this conflict between escalating and keeping it at a lower level, providing support to militant groups and stuff? You think that could be interesting development to look at? Thanks.
Jürgen, do you want to start?
Should we collect 2?
We can, yeah, let's have your question and then you.
Okay, thank you very much for the informative presentation. My question is, I'm originally from Ethiopia, and I'm seriously following the conflict there, the war, every day. Both the Tigrayan war and the Amhara war now. And my question is the precision of the data in this area, particularly. Because estimates in Tigray war, it has been estimated approximately 1 million fatalities in Tigray. And now the war in Amhara region, the same motivation, the same system. The government is against the people. The same army, the same mechanized drones, all civilians. And the area is 5 times bigger than Tigray. And as long as I follow, there are a lot of fatalities every day. I follow it. I don't have the accurate data, but I follow it because my family lives there in the conflict, including my son, the only son. So I'm very much concerned. And you said that it's only 2,190 casualties. You can imagine 5 times bigger than Tigray, a big area. How did you collect the data? Where did you get it? If the government is a source, I don't accept that data. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jürgen, you can start with the first question, and Therese, you can take the 2 others. Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to Syria and democracy and the role of the West, so I focused on this now in terms of war and potential for conflict. Now, when it came to Western support, I think to a certain extent, this is overstated in the sense that I think it's very important that we recognize Syrian agency, and that HDS, which in the end was, the brunt of the force that defeated Assad, it wasn't like they were the West's best friends. They weren't built up by the West. The West had kind of pragmatically agreed to working with them, and the HDS had transformed throughout the conflict to become a more moderate, coherent force than what they had been previously in the Syrian civil war. When it comes to democracy, I think it's important that we recognize that, the Assad regime was an extremely authoritarian government. So compared to the Assad regime, what we have now is, it's not a democracy, but it's a space for civil society. Now, this is one of those trajectories where there is that hope-fear balance that's very, very important. The fear, of course, is that al-Sharia will become kind of a religious version of Assad. That is a fear that many talk about. The hope, of course, is that what we have seen of the Idlib province, where civil society was much more vibrant than, it was completely unallowed and destroyed forcibly in the Assad-controlled areas. In Idlib, it had more of a breathing space. That's not saying that it was ideal conditions. It's not saying it was like, Norway, but it was a freer space. So moving from having an allowed civil society to having a functioning democracy, at this moment, that's a leap of faith, but that's really the hope. Whether we will get there, I mean, that's, a many-year process. So I hope we'll get there, but, I'm not going to sit here and guarantee it.
Thank you. Therese, the question about India and Pakistan and then Ethiopia?
Yes. I think that nuclear weapons can definitely have a calming effect on this conflict. And we saw that the conflict, although also involving clashes, it was very much sort of issuing threats and this propaganda or information sort of conflict. So the nuclear weapons definitely have an important role there, but I think it's worrying that these tensions prevail. They've been there for a very long time, and all the militant groups in the Kashmir region as well. So this is definitely something to keep an eye on. But yes, I do think that they have a sort of calming effect on this conflict. Ethiopia, yes, it's extremely hard to find good information from Ethiopia. Everything is biased. We do have quite good and detailed information. So UCDP collects events data, right? So we need to know each and every single event, like airstrike, clash, mine, and so on. And from there, we sort of aggregate to what you see in these graphs. So it's hard for us to just take a number. Sudan, we have this lump of fatalities and just add it to the data, because we need to separate between different actors and dates and locations and so on. So in Ethiopia, we have pretty good knowledge of the incidents, but there are no fatality numbers available. And this was the case for when the Tigray war was very intense, but also in the Amhara region. So the problem is sort of combining all these places and incidents with the fatality numbers. In Tigray, after a while, so the reason why the numbers are high but still maybe conservative, UCDP is always conservative. We want to be sort of a baseline. Fatalities may be much higher. And we don't include very biased information. So the reason why we could include the high numbers for Ethiopia was that later government representatives admitted their own losses. So what you see in the data is mostly side A fatalities. We don't know a lot about how many rebels were killed. And also with the civilians, all the massacres, we do know some, but there's definitely a lot that is not included. And the Amhara situation is similar, right? So hopefully we can improve this data in the future, but we're not trusting government statements about how many rebels they've killed, because that's we don't include that type of information in our data. We do include when they admit their own losses or if we have credible reports. So triangulating the information, being able to include. So it's definitely a very hard situation in the Amhara region as well, and the figures may not represent that. We do have some, so the numbers I showed on the screen are only for the state-based fighting between like the Fano groups and the government, but there's also a lot of one-sided violence, right? Both from the government and from the Fano group. So those will be visible in the other, in the one-sided category of the data.
But I think what Therese is saying here is really important, that, first of all, these are conservative numbers, but also what you mentioned in your presentation is that you do backdate. So, you know, if there will be more information coming out of Amhara next year, it will be able to update it. But I think your point is very well taken.
I can give you a very good source.
Please do.
Sorry. There is an organization, non-governmental in USA. They are seriously following, collecting data every day. I think more precise data, I can say.
Yes. Thank you.
See, we had two more questions here, Nils Petter and then the gentleman in the back. So I suggest we take these two questions and then... Yep.
Thank you. I have two questions or perhaps comments. One relates to the exceptionally peaceful period from about 1990 to 2010. And I agree that this is what sticks out most clearly in the long-term development of the lethality of war. It seems to me that the main reason why this period was exceptionally peaceful was the evaporation of the East-West conflict. If you look back before 1990, the three largest conflicts, the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, all of these were fueled by the East-West conflict. That is not to say that they didn't have local causes, but the size of the conflict was determined very much by the investment that both the East and the West made in these conflicts. And if you look at the most recent peak, the war between Russia and Ukraine, again, is fueled by exactly the same division that you had during the Cold War. So I wonder if you've considered looking at, in the long-term picture, how many of the fatalities can be ascribed to this bipolar world, which for a while was not so important, but which seems to be coming back. My second question relates to a larger issue of is the world becoming more peaceful or not? And this relates, I think, depends very much on your time perspective. If you take the most recent 20 years, clearly the world is becoming more violent. If you go back to 1946, then there is still a long-term decline in the amount of violence as measured by battle deaths. If you go back to World War II, of course, the decline is even clearer. Furthermore, if you look not at absolute deaths, but relative deaths, battle deaths as a proportion of the world population, then the long-term decline becomes even clearer. I think that's worth keeping in mind in order not to be overwhelmed by pessimism. Thank you.
And then the gentleman behind.
Thank you. My name is Buttarafi. I'm from Oromia in Ethiopia. I think you have said pretty much about the shortcomings of data from Ethiopia. Even Oromia, the largest region in Ethiopia, have been under conflict since 2018, although it is Abiy own home region. Okay, you have said the shortage, and I expected a little more comment from Ethiopia, especially Oromia, where, as my brother from the northern Ethiopia, Amhara, mentioned, we do have concern We hear everything, we follow every day, and that is that. In general, and also he pointed that the world is not becoming a better place. And your data shows that, thank you for the data, and this is a lower facility, low conflict and up and down. How is data accessible for the major cause? What we are looking at the symptoms, just the description of fatalities, conflicts here and there around the world. I do agree that the world is not becoming a better place, given the development of technologies, information, knowledge, everything, and reached. We talk about poverty reduction, but we fail to reduce conflicts. Whom do you think is behind all these messes? And do you think that the liberal democracy, Western democracy, can be a good solution for the other cultures to contain conflicts? Thank you.
Thank you. I think those were very broad and big questions. That is great to end the seminar on. So I'll give both Teresa and Jørgen the possibility to answer. So Teresa, we can start with you and comment on the data as well.
Yes. So is the world becoming more peaceful or not? It's definitely very important to keep in mind that this is a short time period. I mean, it's a long time period for some sort of use of the data, but it's a short time period in sort of the history of humanity. So yes, I think that these trends are driven by a few very lethal wars. So it's hard to say that based on this. I mean, there will be these sharp increases when we have big wars, and we don't have data for hundreds of years, which would be very interesting. But the ones like historians that do study the acceptance of violence, for example, in society, shows that we're actually getting a bit more peaceful. So that's hopeful. The East-West divide, it's definitely important in many conflicts today as well. But I do think that we need to see that conflicts are more complex and that economic incentives, so not maybe the ideology-based division that we saw during the Cold War and those conflicts, but also the economic interests with investments from, for example, China, and how that sort of plays into this. Oromia, we do have that in the data. So so UCDP looks at conflict issues, which means that there can be a conflict over government power in a country, but there can also be, at the same time, several conflicts over different territories. So in Ethiopia, the Tigray conflict is registered as a conflict over government because the TPLF stated that they wanted to overthrow the government of Ethiopia, whereas the Amhara conflict is coded as a territorial one, and Oromia is coded as another territorial conflict. So the Oromia conflict is in the data as well. It doesn't make it to the top 10 list or the ones that I discussed here, but we do have that conflict in the data as well with OLA. The same problem with information. We do have a lot of claims from the OLA, but it's very hard to verify. So please share any advice on sources if you have any. We're really happy to revise the data if we can find better information. What else? Liberal democracy. Yes, I think that's a really big and very complicated question to answer. The relationship between democracy and peace, that democracies don't fight each other and so on. But we also know that the process, democratization process, can be prone to conflict. So it's autocracies and democracies are more stable than the sort of transitioning countries. So I think that's a huge question and something that can have a lot of sort of implications.
Jørgen, do you want to have the final word?
Yeah, so I think one key answer to the world getting a worse place point that you raised is this internationalized civil war point, that a lot of wars are getting more complex in the sense that not only East-West, but also big regional actors are getting involved in civil wars that have multiple actors. So you have many actors locally, many actors regionally, and many actors internationally enacting kind of their interest in conflicts, which make wars harder to solve, which I think is an important issue raised here. But they also make them more, deadly while they're ongoing, because there's a larger flow of weapons, etc. I'm going to go a little bit out of my comfort zone and make a data point. And that is that the more extreme a conflict is, the worse the data is. And I think this is one of those issues where the conflict trends reports basically have to play catch up on themselves. So the next issue is going to be better on 2022 than this year's issue is on 2022. And I'm just going to highlight 3 conflicts which really illustrate this. Now, in Tigray, not only was there a lot of violence going on, obviously, but there was also a blockade, meaning that you couldn't even, people there couldn't use the internet, but you couldn't even reach Tigray with a satellite phone. So it was very, very difficult to get any information in and out. So this is one of those areas where, unfortunately, you basically have to, dig up the mass graves to get the numbers. It's that terrible, really. Gaza, the same. The numbers now say 54,000 dead, 10,000 missing, officially. Those are the verified numbers. But estimates from various accounts say that this is 40% underreporting. So when you get verified numbers, maybe we're at 100,000. That's direct deaths. If you do indirect deaths, one estimate is 4 times that. So, the UCDP is not going to cover the indirect deaths, but, that's the scale we're talking about. And there is an information blockade of Gaza, meaning a lot of information comes out, but independent journalists, independent verifiers are not let in. And journalists there are being killed at disproportionate rates compared to any conflict in the world. So the information flow is just very, very imprecise. And the same with Syria, where, as I said, the UN gave up counting. They made a declaration early on in the civil war. We cannot count anymore because it's too chaotic. And I think that's one of the positive sides of the regime change, is that now they're unearthing mass graves. They're finding more precise numbers. They're identifying where the missing people are. So we'll get precise numbers, or not precise, but we'll get backdated numbers in the coming years.
Thank you. I think it's very nice to end with a case researcher commenting on our data. That's excellent. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry we went a little bit over time. The Conflict Trends Report was published today. Please take a copy with you. Thank you for coming.